She was just a calm commercial pilot, until Engine 1 exploded at 35,000 feet. She saved all 236 passengers with skills no one expected. Then two F-16 pilots arrived to escort her plane, and one of them revealed the Top Gun past she had hidden for 11 years. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked into the crew briefing room at Los Angeles International Airport a little before 6 in the morning. She carried her flight bag over one shoulder and a cup of black coffee in her other hand. She had flown this same route to Chicago more times than she could count. To everyone at the airline, she was simply Captain Mitchell, a calm and reliable pilot who had been with the company for 9 years. Nobody in that briefing room knew that she had spent 14 years before that flying fighter jets for the United States Navy. Sarah was 41 years old. She had short brown hair, tired but alert eyes, and a quiet way of speaking that made people trust her instantly. Her first officer that morning was a young man named David Reyes, only 29 years old, with just under 4 years of commercial flying experience. He liked flying with Captain Mitchell because she was patient with him and never made him feel small when he made mistakes. "Morning, Captain," David said as he took his seat across from her. "Morning, David," Sarah replied, opening her folder of flight documents. "Looks like clear skies most of the way to Chicago. Should be an easy one today." They reviewed the weather reports, checked the fuel numbers, and went through the standard pre-flight paperwork together. Flight 458 was a Boeing 777 carrying 236 passengers and crew. It was a normal Tuesday flight, nothing special about it on paper. Families were flying to visit relatives. Business travelers were heading to meetings. A group of college students were going home for a holiday break. None of them knew that the woman flying their plane had once been one of the most skilled pilots the Navy had ever trained. Sarah had made the decision to leave the military 11 years earlier, right after finishing her last tour as an instructor at the Navy's Advanced Fighter Training Program, often called Top Gun by people outside the Navy. She had trained some of the best pilots who later went on to fly in real combat missions. But after so many years of high-stress flying, she wanted a quieter life. She wanted to build a career where she could still fly, but without the danger of combat missions or the long times away from home. Commercial aviation gave her that chance. She kept her past private, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she wanted to be judged for her work now, not for what she used to do. Before joining the Navy, Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio, far from any ocean or naval base. Her father had been a mechanic who fixed small airplanes at the local airfield, and as a young girl, Sarah spent countless afternoons watching the little planes take off and land. She used to say that she fell in love with flying before she even understood what it meant to fly. When she turned 18, she joined the Navy with one simple goal in mind, to become a pilot. Very few women were flying fighter jets at that time, and the training was harder for her in some ways than for many of her classmates, simply because she had to prove herself again and again. But Sarah never asked for anything to be made easier. She worked longer hours, studied harder, and pushed herself past her limits, until she became not just a pilot, but one of the finest pilots in her entire class. By the time she reached her 30s, Sarah had flown more than 3,000 hours in fighter jets, including several combat deployments overseas. She had faced situations that most people could never imagine, flying through storms, handling battle damage, and making split-second decisions where a single mistake could mean death. When the Navy offered her a position as an instructor at the Advanced Fighter Training School, she accepted immediately, seeing it as a chance to pass on everything she had learned to the next generation. For 5 years, she trained hundreds of young pilots, pushing them to their limits the same way she had once been pushed. Many of those pilots went on to become squadron leaders, test pilots, and decorated combat aviators. But very few people outside that world ever knew her name, because that was simply how the military preferred it. Skilled instructors like Sarah worked quietly, shaping the future of naval aviation without seeking any public recognition. When Sarah finally decided to retire from active service, she was already considered a legend within the small and tightly knit community of fighter pilots. But stepping into civilian life meant starting over in many ways. She had to attend commercial pilot training all over again, learning new systems, new rules, and a completely different style of flying. Fighter jets were built for speed, aggression, and split-second combat maneuvers. Commercial airliners were built for comfort, stability, and careful, steady flying. It took Sarah nearly a year of retraining before she felt fully confident flying large passenger jets. But once she did, she quickly became known within the airline as one of the most careful, professional, and dependable captains on the entire roster. The flight began normally. The plane pushed back from the gate at exactly 7:15 in the morning. David handled the radio communication with air traffic control while Sarah guided the aircraft down the taxiway toward the runway. The takeoff was smooth. Within 20 minutes, they had climbed to their cruising height of 35,000 feet and leveled off for what should have been a calm 4-hour flight to Chicago. For the first 90 minutes, everything was quiet. Passengers watched movies, drank coffee, and slept. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with the drink cart. David relaxed in his seat, checking the instruments every few minutes out of habit rather than concern. Then, at 8:52 in the morning, somewhere over the state of Nevada, something changed. Sarah felt it before she saw it on the instruments. A small shake ran through the airplane, so light that most people would not have noticed it. But Sarah's years of flying had trained her to feel even the smallest change in an aircraft. "David, do you feel that?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. David checked his gauges. "I'm seeing a small rise in temperature on engine 1, he said. "But it still looks within normal range." 30 seconds later, the temperature reading jumped sharply. A warning light lit up on the panel. Then, without any further warning, there was a loud bang from the right side of the aircraft. The whole plane shook hard enough that passengers in the back screamed. Through the small windows, some passengers could see black smoke pouring from the right engine. "Engine 1 failure." David called out, quickly reaching for the emergency checklist that all pilots train to use in such situations. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with total focus. She began working through the engine shutdown procedure, cutting fuel to the damaged engine and activating the fire suppression system built into the wing. But almost immediately, a second problem appeared. The failure of the engine had damaged one of the hydraulic lines that controlled the plane's flight surfaces. Warning lights across the cockpit began flashing one after another. "We're losing hydraulic pressure on System 1, David said, his voice tightening with stress. "System 2 pressure is also dropping." Sarah felt the control column grow heavier under her hands. The plane was becoming harder to fly with each passing second. She quickly understood that this was no longer a simple single-engine problem. The damage had spread into other critical systems. She needed to think fast, and she needed every bit of skill she had built over more than 2 decades of flying. For a brief moment, something changed inside Sarah. The calm airline captain gave way to the instincts of the fighter pilot she used to be. She did not panic. She did not freeze. Instead, her mind moved into a state of total clarity, the same state she used to enter years before while flying through dangerous training exercises at speeds most people could never imagine. "David, I need you to talk to the passengers and keep the cabin crew calm," Sarah said. "I'm going to fly this aircraft. We still have one working engine and partial hydraulics. We can manage this, but it will take some unusual flying." David looked at her, surprised by the sudden strength and confidence in her voice, but he trusted her completely. He picked up the radio and made contact with air traffic control. "Denver Center, this is United 458, David said. "We have an engine failure and partial hydraulic failure. Requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The response came quickly. "United 458, Denver Center. We copy your emergency. Turn left heading 090. Nearest suitable airport is Peterson Air Force Base, 160 miles from your position. Sarah nodded when she heard this. A military airfield had longer runways and stronger emergency response teams, which could be important if the landing did not go smoothly. She began turning the aircraft carefully, using small and precise control movements to avoid putting more stress on the already damaged systems. As Flight 458 continued its slow and difficult path toward Peterson Air Force Base, two F-16 fighter jets from the Colorado Air National Guard were in the area conducting a routine training exercise. When their base heard about the emergency, they ordered the two jets to fly close to the commercial airplane and check its condition from the outside. The lead pilot was Major Tom Brennan, an experienced fighter pilot with more than 15 years of service. His wingman was Captain Anna Cole, a younger pilot who had only joined the squadron 2 years earlier. Both pilots turned their jets toward Flight 458 and quickly closed the distance. United 458, this is Falcon 1, Major Brennan said over the radio. We are two F-16s from the Colorado Air National Guard. We will fly next to you and check your aircraft. Please continue as instructed by Air Traffic Control. Falcon 1, United 458, Sarah replied. Thank you for the support. We have significant damage to Engine 1 and partial hydraulic failure. Aircraft is flyable, but control response is reduced. As Major Brennan brought his fighter jet closer to the damaged airliner, he could see the burned and blackened area around the right engine. Pieces of metal were missing from the engine cover, and a thin trail of smoke still followed the plane through the sky. It looked far worse than a normal engine failure. But what caught his attention even more was how steady the big plane remained in the air, despite the clear damage. United 458, Falcon 1, Brennan said. I can see heavy damage to your right engine. How is the aircraft handling? Sarah's response came back clear and controlled. Falcon 1, we are managing with reduced hydraulics. Using engine power and manual trim to help control our flight path. We should be able to reach Peterson, but it will not be a normal landing. Major Brennan frowned slightly inside his cockpit. The words she used, and the calm, exact way she explained the situation, reminded him of pilots he had known during his years in fighter training. Most commercial pilots would describe an emergency in simpler terms. This pilot spoke like someone who had trained for combat emergencies, not just civilian ones. You fly like you've done this kind of thing before, Brennan said over the radio, half question and half observation. There was a short pause before Sarah answered. Falcon 1, let's focus on getting this aircraft safely on the ground. We can talk about flying styles once everyone is out of the plane. Brennan smiled slightly to himself, though nobody could see it. Something about her tone felt familiar, but he could not place it yet. He kept his jet close to the airliner's wing, watching every movement as Sarah guided the giant aircraft through the sky using controls that were only working at half their normal strength. Inside the cabin, David had already spoken to the flight attendants and prepared the passengers for what might be a hard landing. He explained the situation honestly but calmly, following the training all pilots receive for handling passenger communication during emergencies. Some passengers cried quietly. Others held hands with the person next to them. A few prayed. But there was no panic, no shouting, because David's calm voice matched the calm confidence coming from the cockpit. Among the passengers was a woman named Grace Kim, traveling with her 7-year-old son to visit her parents in Chicago. When the announcement came over the speakers, she pulled her son close and whispered to him that everything would be fine, even though her own hands were shaking. 2 rows behind her sat a retired schoolteacher named Walter Higgins, who had flown hundreds of times in his life and knew from the sound of the engine that this emergency was serious. He calmly helped the young flight attendant near him check that other passengers had their seatbelts fastened properly, speaking in a steady voice to anyone who looked frightened. Near the back of the plane, a group of college students who had been laughing and talking loudly before the emergency now sat in complete silence, gripping the armrests of their seats. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced calm, repeating the brace position instructions and checking that tray tables were up and seatbelts were tight. One young attendant named Priya Patel later said that what she remembered most was how the captain's voice never once wavered during any of her announcements. "She spoke to us like she already knew exactly how this was going to end," Priya said. "It made all of us believe it too." David walked briefly through the first part of the cabin himself before returning to help Sarah, offering a few calm words to nervous passengers and reassuring them that the crew had full control of the situation. It was a small gesture, but for many passengers it made a lasting difference in how they remembered those frightening minutes. Sarah continued flying with total concentration. She adjusted the throttle on the one working engine again and again, using small changes in engine power to help turn and level the aircraft, a technique that is not commonly taught in regular airline training but is well known among pilots who have handled damaged aircraft in combat situations. She used trim adjustments to help balance the plane despite the loss of full hydraulic control. Every movement she made was smooth, careful, and exact. As Peterson Air Force Base came into view on the radar and then finally through the front windows, Sarah began preparing for the final approach. The reduced hydraulic power meant the landing gear might not lower normally, and the wing flaps that usually help slow the plane for landing were only partially working. She would need to land at a higher speed than normal, using every bit of runway available. "Falcon 1, United 458, Sarah said. "We are beginning our final approach. Landing gear extension may be delayed due to hydraulic limitations. Requesting fire and rescue standing by on the runway." "Copy that, United 458, Brennan replied. "Emergency services are already in position. You are cleared for approach. Runway length is more than enough for your aircraft. Just get her down safely." David worked quickly through the checklist for landing gear extension. When the normal hydraulic system failed to lower the gear completely, he activated the manual backup system, a set of controls that use gravity and a separate release mechanism to force the wheels down when the main system fails. After a tense few seconds, 3 green lights appeared on the panel, showing that all 3 sets of wheels were locked in position. "Gear down and locked," David said, relief clear in his voice. Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on the runway ahead. The airplane was descending faster than normal because of the limited flap control, but she compensated by adjusting her approach angle and using small bursts of power from the one working engine to control the rate of descent. It required constant attention, moving the controls almost every second to keep the wings level and the nose pointed correctly. "You're looking good, United 458, Brennan said, watching from his position beside the aircraft. "Nice and steady. Just like that." The big jet crossed over the end of the runway just a few feet above the ground. Sarah pulled back gently on the controls to slow the rate of descent at the last moment, and the main wheels touched down with a solid but controlled bump. The nose wheel came down a few seconds later. Sarah immediately applied the brakes and used the one working engine in reverse thrust mode to help slow the heavy aircraft down as quickly as possible. The plane rolled down the runway, slowing steadily, surrounded on both sides by fire trucks and emergency vehicles with their lights flashing. Finally, after what felt like a very long time to everyone on board, the aircraft came to a complete stop, still upright, still in one piece, with all 236 people safely aboard. Inside the cabin, passengers began to clap and cheer, some crying with relief, others hugging the people sitting next to them. David let out a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. Sarah finished the shutdown checklist calmly, her hands finally slowing down after nearly 20 minutes of intense flying. Emergency crews quickly surrounded the aircraft to check for any fire risk, while stairs were brought to help passengers safely leave the plane. As the evacuation began, Major Brennan landed his F-16 nearby and immediately asked permission to walk over to the aircraft to meet the crew. When he approached Sarah on the runway, still wearing her captain's uniform, he studied her face carefully for a moment. Something about her eyes, her posture, and the calm authority in the way she stood was deeply familiar to him. "Captain," he said slowly, "have we met before? You remind me of someone I trained with a long time ago." Sarah looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Major Brennan," she said quietly, "the last time we spoke, you were a young lieutenant, and you called me Instructor Mitchell." Brennan's eyes widened. Instructor Mitchell? From the Fighter Weapons School. He paused, his mind quickly connecting the pieces. Sarah Mitchell. You were one of the best instructors I ever had. I heard you left the Navy years ago. I never imagined I'd see you flying commercial planes. Sarah gave a small, tired smile. I wanted a quieter life, Tom. But some things you learn never really leave you. Captain Anna Cole, who had landed shortly after Brennan, walked over just in time to hear the last part of the conversation. Wait, she said, looking between the two of them, you're telling me the pilot who just landed that damaged Boeing with no full hydraulics used to train fighter pilots? Not just any fighter pilots, Brennan said, still slightly amazed. Some of the best pilots in our squadron trained under Instructor Mitchell. She was known as one of the sharpest and most demanding instructors in the whole program. If you made it through her course, you knew you were ready for anything. Anna looked at Sarah with new respect. That explains a lot. No normal commercial pilot flies like that. The way you used engine power to control that aircraft, that was fighter pilot flying, not airline flying. Sarah nodded slightly, accepting the recognition with quiet humility. Training like that stays with you your whole life, she said. Today, it helped bring 236 people home safely. That's all that matters to me. News of the emergency landing spread quickly through both the airline industry and military circles. Within hours, aviation officials from the airline, along with investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, arrived at Peterson Air Force Base to begin studying what had happened and how the crew had managed to save the aircraft under such difficult conditions. During the official interviews that followed over the next several days, investigators were amazed at the technical skill involved in the emergency landing. Experts studying the flight data noted that the combination of engine power adjustments and manual control techniques used during the approach were unusual for commercial aviation, more closely resembling advanced military emergency procedures. When they learned about Sarah's background as a former Top Gun instructor, many of the technical questions about the landing were finally answered. One senior investigator, a man named Richard Cole who had spent more than 20 years studying aviation accidents, later said that Flight 458 would likely be studied in flight schools for years to come. In all my years doing this work, he said during a press briefing, I have rarely seen a case where the actions of a single pilot made such a clear difference between a tragedy and a successful outcome. The data shows that a less experienced pilot might not have been able to keep this aircraft under control at all. His report noted that the specific combination of asymmetric engine power management and manual trim adjustment used during the descent required a level of hand and eye coordination that went beyond standard commercial pilot training, and matched almost exactly with techniques taught in advanced military flight programs. The investigation also studied the performance of the aircraft's manual backup systems, confirming that David's quick action in activating the manual landing gear release had been essential to the safe landing. Engineers from Boeing traveled to Peterson Air Force Base to examine the damaged engine and surrounding structure, later confirming that the uncontained engine failure had been caused by a rare manufacturing defect in one of the turbine blades. The airline used the findings to inspect similar engines across its entire fleet, a decision that aviation safety experts later praised as an important step in preventing future incidents. The airline's chief pilot, a woman named Karen Lawson who had worked with Sarah for years, was surprised to learn the full details of her colleague's military history. I always knew Sarah was an excellent pilot, Karen said during an internal safety review. I just never understood how excellent. Now it makes complete sense. David Reyes, reflecting on the events days later, told friends that flying with Sarah on that day was unlike any experience he had ever had in his career. I've flown with a lot of good captains, he said, but what I saw that day was different. It was like watching someone who had trained her entire life for exactly that moment. She never lost focus, never doubted herself, not even for a second. 6 months after the accident investigation was completed, Sarah returned to full flying duties with the airline. She continued to fly the same routes she always had, quietly and professionally, just as she had done for years. But something had changed within the wider aviation community. Her story, though never fully publicized to the general public, spread quietly among pilots, becoming something of a respected legend within flying circles. A few months later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Captain Karen Ellis, the current commanding officer of the Navy's fighter training program where Sarah had once taught. "Commander Mitchell," Karen said, using Sarah's old military title out of respect, "I heard about what happened on that flight. What you did that day proved something important. The training we give our pilots doesn't just prepare them for combat. It prepares them for life, in any aircraft, in any situation." Karen went on to invite Sarah back to the training school as a guest speaker, to share her story with the newest group of student pilots. Sarah agreed, seeing it as a meaningful way to pass on what she had learned to the next generation of aviators. In the weeks leading up to her visit, Sarah found herself thinking often about her own early days as a student pilot, back when she had been the nervous young woman sitting in a classroom much like the one she would soon be speaking in. She remembered how frightened she had been during her first difficult training flights, and how her own instructors had pushed her past what she believed were her limits. She wanted the students she would soon meet to understand that fear was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be managed and used, the same way she had used it high above Nevada while flying a badly damaged aircraft. Sarah also spent time preparing a short technical presentation, using the actual flight data from Flight 458 to show the young pilots exactly what had happened during those critical minutes, from the first vibration she had felt to the final moment the wheels touched the runway at Peterson Air Force Base. She wanted them to see, in real numbers and real charts, how small and precise control adjustments had kept the aircraft flying when the systems around it were failing one after another. Weeks later, Sarah stood in front of a room full of young Navy pilots, wearing her airline uniform instead of her old flight suit. She told them the story of Flight 458, not to boast about her own skills, but to remind them why their training mattered so much. "Some of you will spend your whole careers flying military aircraft," she told the class. "Others may eventually move into different kinds of flying, just like I did. But wherever your path takes you, remember this. The discipline, the focus, and the skills you build here will follow you for the rest of your life. You never know when you might need them, or whose life might depend on them." As she looked out at the young faces in the room, Sarah thought back to that day over Nevada, to the sound of the engine failing, to the weight of the controls in her hands, and to the 236 lives that had depended on everything she had learned so many years before. She had left the military to find a quieter life, but in that one moment high above the clouds, her two worlds had come together perfectly, proving that true skill, once earned, never truly fades away. After the presentation ended, several students stayed behind to ask Sarah questions, eager to learn more about the exact techniques she had used and how she had managed to stay so calm under such extreme pressure. One young student pilot, a woman named Rachel who reminded Sarah very much of herself many years earlier, asked quietly whether Sarah had ever been afraid during those long minutes over Nevada. Sarah thought about the question carefully before answering. "I was afraid," she admitted, "but fear was never the enemy that day. The real enemy would have been letting that fear stop me from doing my job. Everything you learn here is designed to help you do exactly that, to keep flying, keep thinking, and keep making good decisions, no matter how afraid you might feel inside." Major Brennan, who had also been invited to attend Sarah's presentation, watched from the back of the room with quiet pride. He had flown alongside many skilled pilots throughout his career, but few had left as strong an impression on him as Sarah had that day over the skies of Nevada. As the room slowly emptied, he walked up to her and shook her hand firmly. "Instructor Mitchell," he said, using her old title one final time, "the Navy's loss was the airline's gain. But today, I think we got a little bit of you back." Sarah smiled and thanked him, before gathering her things and preparing to fly back home. As she walked out of the training building and into the warm afternoon sun, she felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that the lessons she had learned so long ago, and the skills she had almost never had to use again, had ultimately found their purpose exactly when 236 people needed them the most. She boarded a commercial flight home that same evening, just another passenger among many, quietly proud of the life she had built, and grateful for the path that had led her there.